So in chapter 17, we've been learning about the progressive movement. Progressivism means the movement to reform our government, to make it more responsive to voters, and to make it more inclusive for all. And by all, I mean all, not just white males, but all, men and women, minorities, people of different orientations, everyone, to make our government more inclusive. And so today we get to learn about a very exciting part of this movement, which is again still going on today, the movement for women's rights. And so today we're going to get to learn how women gained the right to vote, but yet many unfinished goals that we'll begin learning about throughout American 2, and we'll continue learning about, but again, the movement of women in public life. And so as a result of social and economic change, many women entered public life both as workers as well as reformers.
It was we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. Susan B. Anthony. On November 2nd, 1920, more than 8 million women voted for the first time in American history. It was 144 years after Thomas Jefferson proclaimed equality as the foundation of our government that women were granted the right to participate in the electoral process. 2 women would spearhead the development and eventual success of the women's suffrage movement: Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Together, they would revolutionize the political and social condition of women in American society. In the early 19th century, women had few rights. They were barred from most professions. Opportunities to attend college were almost non-existent, and they could not vote. A married woman was legally the property of her husband. Everything she had belonged to him. But in 1848, a group of young women became determined to overthrow the customs and laws regarding women. They met in Seneca Falls, New York, at a conference on women's rights. Among those in attendance were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, 2 women who would challenge America to launch a social revolution. While at the conference, Stanton and Anthony adopted a statement on women's rights deliberately modeled on the Declaration of Independence. In it, they would accuse the nation of entire disfranchisement of half the population and demand the rights and privileges that belong to all persons as citizens of the United States. Stanton and Anthony would also cement their battle for women's suffrage, or the right to vote, as the primary goal of their movement. They believed this would lead to the greatest social and political changes. Over the next several decades, their movement would inspire countless Americans to social and political activism. Stanton became the leading voice and philosopher of the women's rights and suffrage movement. And Anthony became the powerhouse of the movement, leading legions of women in the struggle for voting rights. They devoted 50 years to the women's suffrage movement, but neither one lived to see women gain the right to vote. Today, they are remembered for their unequivocal determination in fighting for equal treatment under the law.
So, women in the workforce. The idea of the cult of domesticity, the idea that a woman's ideal place was in the home, is an idea that dates back to the origins of our country, that has its roots in religion, that a woman's primary role, according to many, was that of a homemaker and a caregiver for her children. But yet, not all felt this way. Many felt, and still do certainly, that a woman, in the eyes of the law, is on equal par to a man. But yet, equality and domesticity, according to many, were at odds. Because if a woman is equal to a man, then why should she be relegated to that of a homemaker? Why should that be the expectation in her life if she is the equal of a man? But also we have to think of theory versus reality. While in theory many held the idea at this time that a woman's place was at home, in reality most women were working. And so the luxury of a woman being at home, again, the idea is really constraining in its own nature. But to some, that concept of a woman being at home, well, most women were working outside the home, let's be honest. Most women were having to work to provide for their families because most couldn't afford to stay at home. Poor women were generally working for wages outside the home. On farms, women's roles had remained unchanged from what they had been for centuries. Women would perform household tasks, raise livestock, help with crops, generally, the traditional role of a woman that we've seen in agrarian societies since the Neolithic Revolution, if you will. And so little had changed on the farms. By 1900, 1 in 5 women held wage-based jobs. Over 1/4 of these jobs were in manufacturing. Women comprised half of all workers in the garment trade, in textiles. And remember, the largest reason for this is that employers could pay women half what they paid men for the same job. Women were also able to find jobs in offices, in stores, and in classrooms. To be a teacher at this time only required a high school education, but we must also remember that only 1.3% of Americans even had a high school education by 1900. Women could find work in business schools. Women could find work as bookkeepers, as stenographers, which is a court reporter, or as typist. So yes, women's roles in the workplace were very limited. You don't see on this list management positions. You don't see on this list the opportunity for equal pay for equal work. And even though legally those opportunities are supposed to exist today, in reality, we don't find it as often. And we'll get to that further on in US 2. Now, the statistic about 1/4 of women working in manufacturing did not apply to 1870. So you can see a little difference between 1870 and 1900, a small amount of progress, if you will. Because in 1870, we found that 70% of women workers were employed in the domestic industry, cleaning homes. It's an honorable profession. There's not a thing wrong with it. My mother-in-law cleans homes for a living. I've cleaned homes for a living. My family has done it. Again, it's an honorable profession. But I want to point out the limitations inherent when you see that of the women working in 1870, 70% of them were in domestic work, cleaning homes, cooking meals for others. In fact, this was by far what most African American and immigrant women were doing for a living. Married immigrants could take in piecework, which means it's a form of a cottage industry where they could do work at home and sell it to industries. It's a very ancient practice, still in use at this time. And many women could also find work as boarders, meaning taking in guests in the hospitality industry, lending out rooms. Again, what I'd like to point out is these are opportunities for women. But if we were to put a list side by side of opportunities for women in 1900 and then opportunities for men, you would see a stark difference. And so the movement for gender equality is based not only on political equality, but on economic equality. If we are to have equal opportunity, that means equal opportunity for all, not just all men. And so understandably, many women get involved. Many women industrial workers sought to reform working conditions in their industries. Again, sometimes it takes a tragedy like the 1910 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire to point out terrible working conditions. But really, the women's rights movement dates back much further. Think of the strike at Lowell, Massachusetts. 800 mill girls walked off of the factory. Women also formed cultural clubs and reform groups. Many educated, wealthy women who had the time and the resources became deeply involved in this movement. Many women active in public life were also able to attend colleges for women. In fact, among college-educated women, almost half of them chose to remain unmarried, because many women in 1900 began to realize that if, in the eyes of the law, a woman is the property of her husband, many women didn't want to be a part of that. Can you imagine entering into a union in which you voluntarily agree to become the property of someone else, despite the 13th Amendment? And yet that was the understanding in the eyes of the law at that time. And so many educated women said, I want nothing to do with marriage if that means I have to become the property of my husband. And so many did work on social reforms. But can you imagine how they must have been perceived or treated or demonized? Can you imagine what the media would have said of women who chose not to marry at this time? I mean, in this day and age, when I chose to remain unmarried and I was in my mid-20s, and then as I was getting into my late 20s and I still chose to remain unmarried, choosing instead to focus on my career, in this day and age, that was still considered odd. And it's even considered more odd for a young woman to do that. Even in this day and age, they can still be the subject of comments. But can you imagine how much courage that would have taken in 1900 to do that? And so, these women are reformers. Targeted the workplace, economic reform, workplace conditions, equal treatment, targeted housing, Targeted education, because most schools at this time did not allow women. Targeted also food and drugs. For example, a female doctor in the late 1800s named Elizabeth Blackwell conducted a national survey and found that most women were very unhealthy because of the nutritional resources available to them and because of the lifestyles that they were forced to live in. One of the most famous women in this movement, who formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was Susan B. Anthony. And again, if you're looking for a good woman to study, look no further. Susan B. Anthony is a hero in the women's rights movement. She believed that suffrage, or the right to vote, would lead to a better world for women, because it would empower women to participate in the electoral process. It would lead eventually to women like Jeannette Rankin, who became the first female congressperson. Again, can you imagine what courage that would have taken? To rise above a world that views women as property and to become empowered through the vote. Now, did you know that the movement to vote for women took 70 years? 70 years. In 1848, it was decided at the Seneca Falls Convention that women would work towards the right to vote. And for 70 years, really 72 years if we want to be exact, until 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. So ladies, that should be empowering to you. But it should also encourage you to be patient, to be active in civic life. Because the movement for suffrage was a long process. Number one, women had to convince state legislatures. When the women's rights movement was rejected multiple times at the national level, women then went to the states. Did you know that when the women's rights movement petitioned, which by the way, the movement began in Asheville, North Carolina, in our state. But did you know, which by the way, that's where the first women's rights movement in North Carolina was held. Something we can be proud of. But did you know that movement, when it petitioned the General Assembly of the state of North Carolina, that bill which women introduced was referred to the Committee on Insane Asylums? You know what that means? That means that when women requested the right to vote of the state of North Carolina, they referred it to that Committee on the Insane. They said that's where this belongs. This movement followed a careful and methodical strategy of going state to state, of civil disobedience. You know, Henry David Thoreau believed and practiced that if you are convinced that a law is unethical, it is your moral obligation to break that law peacefully. I don't know how many times Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting. It was many. She and many others, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, believed so firmly that women should have the right to vote, they would go on hunger strikes in prison. And I actually have a rather graphic clip to show you from a movie called Ironclad Angels.
We watched that with Miss.
Yeah, of the force feeding. Yeah, and I think Miss Stewart showed it to you. Yeah, I think I've got it coming up in a second. Now, civil disobedience. Getting themselves thrown in jail. That takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage. And then finally, the end game was to push for a constitutional amendment to grant women the right to vote.
Other progressive women concentrated on another moral issue, one that had plagued the nation since the Reconstruction days following the Civil War: suffrage, the right for women to vote.
1912. All along Fifth Avenue, from Washington Square to 57th, were gathered thousands of men and women of New York. Women doctors, lawyers, architects, artists, actresses, sculptors, waitresses, domestic and industrial workers, all marched with an intensity and purpose that astonished the crowds that lined the street.
Founded in 1890, the leaders of the National American Women's Suffrage Association used 3 different approaches to try to win the vote for women. First, they attempted to get state governments to grant them suffrage, but only Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho agreed. Suffragettes then decided to take their cause to court, citing the 14th Amendment. It said that states which denied their male citizens the right to vote would lose congressional representation. Women argued that they were citizens too, and therefore the states must allow them to vote. So, Susan B. Anthony and other women made over 150 attempts to vote in 10 different states, forcing the Supreme Court to decide their case. But despite the fact the Supreme Court in 1875 agreed that women were citizens, they concluded that citizenship alone did not automatically grant women the right to vote. Their third approach was to rally support for a constitutional amendment granting suffrage. Time and again, the Senate defeated it. The suffrage campaign marched on, and with America's entry into World War I in 1917, the tide seemed to be turning. Leaders of the women's movement redoubled their efforts. Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt continued the NAWSA's cautious approach, while other women leaders, such as Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, formed a more radical organization, the National Women's Party, which openly blamed the Democrats and used protest marches and even hunger strikes to try to win the vote. Finally, in 1919, Congress approved the 19th Amendment, and the following year the states ratified it, granting women suffrage. The long battle for suffrage had taken 72 years.
So that previous clip did an excellent job of summarizing this movement. As you heard, the state-to-state movement resulted in only 4 states. 4 states granted women the right to vote. Efforts in all of the other states failed. But that's the long game, ladies and gentlemen. That's the patient approach. That's how politics works. Democracy takes time. Swift change is dangerous. Democratic change requires patience, and that's what these women possessed. They also challenged the constitutionality of the 14th Amendment at the Supreme Court. And as you heard in the clip, the Supreme Court ruled that citizenship does not automatically confer the right to vote. And so then came the movement for a constitutional amendment. Now, to get an amendment added to the Constitution is no easy task. Think of the strife required by Lincoln to get the 13th Amendment passed. It was his passion at the end of his life to see slavery ended. And even in the midst of a civil war, it was not an easy task. The 19th Amendment was voted down time and again until 1919. You know, these women shown here did more than just write a letter. They did more than just express concern. They became active. They got out. They did something. They were part of this movement.